There is something on the label of almost every budget whiskey bottle at Dan Murphy's that they are not legally required to tell you in Australia. Caramel colouring. The chemical compound E150A is added to the majority of mass-produced Scotch blends and Irish whiskies to make light, young, grain-heavy spirits look like aged, premium products. In Australia, unlike food products on supermarket shelves, whiskey bottles carry no obligation to declare it. The colour in your glass is not age or wood influence, it is food dye. Today, we are counting down 10 whiskies sold right here in Australia that you should stop buying immediately, and by the end, I'm going to show you the Australian producers and the honest international brands that are actually worth your money and your trust. Stay with me, because several of these names will surprise you. 10. Famous Grouse. The Famous Grouse is Scotland's best-selling whiskey and one of the most recognisable bottles behind every Dan Murphy's counter from Sydney to Perth. The Edrington Group produces it, and they have built decades of goodwill around that red grouse on the label. But examine what you are actually drinking. Famous Grouse is predominantly grain-neutral spirits, blended with a small percentage of malt whiskey to legally qualify as Scotch. The caramel colouring that gives it that warm amber appearance is E150A, a compound that has no flavour contribution and no health benefit. It exists entirely to make a cheap spirit look expensive. Independent whiskey analysts have noted that Famous Grouse carries no age statement on its standard expression, which in the Scotch whisky world means the youngest component in the blend can be as little as 3 years old. 3 years in barrel. Pour a glass and hold it to the light. That colour did not come from oak. For anyone who has been buying Famous Grouse believing they are getting genuine aged Scotch character, you're getting colour chemistry and grain spirit. The grouse on the label is more honest than the whiskey inside the bottle. 9. Ballantine's Finest. Pernod Ricard produces Ballantine's, and it is one of the highest volume Scotch blends sold through BWS and Liquorland stores across Australia. Ballantine's Finest carries no age statement, which again means the youngest whiskey in the blend can be as young as 3 years old. The marketing positions it as a sophisticated choice. The ingredients tell a different story. E150, a caramel colouring, grain-neutral spirits forming the bulk of the blend, and a malt component too small and too young to contribute meaningful character to the final product. Pernod Ricard acquired Ballantine's in 2005, and the post-acquisition production has been engineered entirely around cost efficiency and volume. Independent reviewers who have tracked it across multiple bottling years document the flavour as simple, sweet, and one-dimensional, reflecting a spirit assembled for mass market consumption rather than genuine quality. For Australian consumers paying around $30 at Dan Murphy's, thinking they are choosing something better than a house brand, the truth is the gap between Ballantine's Finest and a cheap no-name blend is largely in the bottle design and the advertising budget. 8. Teacher's Highland Cream. Beam Suntory owns Teacher's, and the name alone is doing enormous marketing work. Highland Cream. The combination of a Scottish geographic reference and a texture descriptor that implies richness and quality. But Teacher's Highland Cream is a blended Scotch whisky with no age statement, built on a grain-neutral spirit base, with the grain component comprising the overwhelming majority of the liquid in every bottle. When independent tasters have analysed Teacher's alongside similar products, the consensus is consistent: thin body, an artificially sweet entry, and a short finish with no complexity suggesting genuine aged malt influence. Teacher's sells through Australian bottle shops primarily on price. Around 25 to 30 Australian dollars positions it as an accessible entry point into Scotch whisky. But here's the problem. Consumers buying Teacher's for the first time as their introduction to Scotch are forming a taste impression of the category based on a product that barely represents it. If your understanding of Scotch whisky was formed by Teacher's Highland Cream, you have been working with false information about one of the world's great spirit categories. 7. Label 5. Label 5 is produced by La Martiniquaise, a French spirits conglomerate that has been quietly building one of the largest blended Scotch whisky operations in the world, based almost entirely on price competition. You find Label 5 at the deepest discount end of the Dan Murphy's Scotch section, often priced below 25 Australian dollars for a full bottle. That price is not a bargain, it is a warning. At that price point, the economics of genuine aged Scotch whisky do not function. The grain to malt ratio in Label 5 skews almost entirely toward cheap grain neutral spirits. The colour is caramel colouring. La Martiniquaise source bulk grain spirit and adds enough malt to legally call the product Scotch whisky, which only requires a minimum of 3 years aging and some malt content. 3 years and some malt. That is the entire bar the product clears. For seniors on a fixed income looking for value, Label 5 is not value. It is the lowest cost way to bottle something that technically qualifies as whiskey without providing any of the experience that makes whiskey worth drinking. 6. Black and white. Diageo produces black and white, a blended scotch with one of the oldest brand histories in the category. The Scotty dogs on the label, one black, one white, have appeared on bottles for well over a century. That history is the entire argument for buying black and white today, because the contents of the modern bottle do not provide one. Diageo has rationalized its blending operations across dozens of brands over the past 2 decades, and black and white has consistently been pushed to the bottom tier of the portfolio in terms of malt content and production investment. The modern expression is grain-neutral spirit, caramel colouring, and a minimal malt component, bottled and sold on the strength of a heritage that the current production process does not honour. Australian bottle shops stock it because the price point moves volume. The terriers on the label have not changed in 100 years. The whiskey inside has changed considerably, and not in your favour. 5. Grant's Family Reserve. William Grant & Sons produces some of the finest whiskey on earth. Glenfiddich, Balvenie and Kinninvie all carry the Grant's name on their distillery paperwork. But Grant's Family Reserve, the triple wood blended scotch that fills lower shelves at bottle shops across Australia, is a different product entirely. William Grant engineered Grant's Family Reserve as a volume product to compete at the bottom of the blended scotch market, and it has been optimized accordingly. No age statement, grain neutral spirit dominant, E150A caramel colouring to deliver visual cues of quality the liquid itself cannot. Independent reviewers consistently describe Grant's Family Reserve as pleasant, but lacking in any genuine character or complexity. It is a functional drink for mixing, for anyone who simply needs something amber in a glass. But it sits alongside genuine quality whiskey carrying the Grant's name, which many Australian consumers associate with Glenfiddich. The name is shared, the quality is not. 4. Chivas Regal 12. Here is where the story shifts from budget products to premium positioning, because Chivas Regal 12-year-old sits at the prestige end of the blended scotch category at Dan Murphy's and First Choice Liquor. 60 to 70 Australian dollars positions Chivas 12 as a step-up purchase, a gift-worthy bottle, a statement of taste. Pernod Ricard produces it, and the 12-year age statement does provide a genuine guarantee that no whiskey in the blend is younger than 12 years old. But the problems begin and end with the production philosophy. Chivas Regal 12 contains E150A caramel colouring. In a 12-year-old whiskey sitting in Australian retail at $60, there is no justification for artificial colouring. The colour of an aged whiskey should come from the barrel. When a distillery adds caramel colouring to a 12-year expression, it is concealing something, inconsistent wood influence, or a grain to malt ratio that produces a liquid paler than the premium positioning demands. Genuine 12-year aged scotch does not need colour assistance. For Australian consumers paying for prestige, you are funding the marketing budget, the iconic bottle design, and the caramel chemistry, not the whiskey. 3. Jameson Irish Whiskey. Jameson is the world's best-selling Irish whiskey, and in Australian bottle shops it has become the default choice when people want something approachable, smooth, and socially acceptable. Irish Distillers, owned by Pernod Ricard, produces Jameson, and triple distillation is the heart of the brand's identity. Triple distillation produces a lighter, smoother spirit because each distillation pass strips more congeners, the flavour compounds that develop character and complexity in whiskey. Smoothness is the selling point, but smoothness in this context means the absence of character, not the presence of quality. What triple distillation creates, combined with the significant proportion of grain, neutral spirits in the Jameson blend, is a whiskey category product that functions as a delivery mechanism for alcohol with minimal interference from flavour. It is inoffensive by design. The caramel colouring gives it warmth. The marketing gives it Irish heritage. The triple distillation process takes away most of what would make it interesting. For the millions of Australians who order Jameson and ginger at the pub, that smoothness is not a mark of quality. It is a production philosophy that prioritised accessibility over substance. 2. Johnnie Walker, Red Label. Diageo's most widely distributed whiskey on the planet, and the bottle that defines blended scotch for more consumers worldwide than any other. The striding man, the Red Label, the brand that built Diageo into one of the most powerful corporations in spirits. And here is the truth that Diageo hopes the advertising budget will drown out. Johnnie Walker Red Label is a minimum age blended Scotch whiskey with no age statement, built on a grain neutral spirit foundation, coloured with E150A caramel, and engineered primarily to be inexpensive to produce and expensive to market. Independent analysts who have traced the production history of Red Label document it as one of the most grain-heavy expressions in the major Scotch blends category. The distinctive smoky note that Red Label carries comes from a small proportion of kale, Islay malt added to the blend, doing enormous work to mask the grain neutrality underneath it. That smoke note is not complexity, it is a flavouring tool for Australian consumers who see Johnnie Walker Red Label at Dan Murphy's for $35 and assume they are buying a reliable quality product backed by Diageo's reputation. The reputation was built on much older, much more expensive expressions in the Walker lineup. Red Label exists to carry the name into a price point that genuine quality cannot reach. The striding man is walking away from what is in that bottle. 1. Jim Beam White Label. And here we arrive at the entry that generates the most debate, because Jim Beam White Label is not Scotch whiskey. It is Kentucky straight bourbon, and bourbon has legal protections that Scotch blends do not. No artificial colouring, no artificial flavouring, minimum 2 years in new charred oak. On those metrics, Jim Beam White is more honestly labelled than most of the blended Scotch whiskies on this list. But Jim Beam White Label is on this list because of what it is not, rather than what the label claims it is. Beam Suntory produces it at minimum legal age, typically around 4 years old, in new oak barrels that are used exactly once before being sold to Scotch distilleries. The result is a bourbon with an aggressively sharp, solvent-forward character that reflects rapid wood extraction from very young spirit in highly active new oak. Independent assessments of Jim Beam White note a harsh vanilla note, a thin mid-palate, and a finish with a hot, rough edge that reflects insufficient aging time. In Australia, it sits at bottle shops for around $35. At that same price, you can find genuinely age-stated bourbon with far more character. Jim Beam White survives on the name. That name was earned by older, better expressions that are not in this bottle. Go check your liquor cabinet right now. If you have been choosing from that list based on familiarity, advertising, or price point, you have been deciding with incomplete information. The caramel colouring in your glass is not age. The smoothness in your Jameson is not quality. The famous names on those labels are mortgages on goodwill that many of these products no longer earn. But before you empty the shelf, stay with me. Because Australia produces some of the most honest whiskey in the world right now, sitting in the same bottle shops as everything we just exposed. Safe Pick 3, Archie Rose White Rye. The Archie Rose Distillery in Rosebery, Sydney is doing something that most of the major global whiskey corporations have stopped doing, making decisions based on what goes in the bottle rather than what fits the cost structure. Their white rye is not aged, which makes it an unusual recommendation, but it demonstrates with absolute clarity what grain-forward spirit tastes like when you remove caramel colouring, artificial intervention, and the shortcuts that define every budget blend on this list. Archie Rose sources Australian rye grain, distills in copper pot and column stills, and bottles without colour addition or chill filtration. The result is a spirit that is transparent, genuinely flavoured by its grain base, and priced honestly for what it is. The nose is fresh, spicy, and herbaceous. The palate delivers real rye character, pepper, and a clean finish. Archie Rose publishes full production transparency on their website. You know what you are buying because they tell you. Available directly from the distillery and through Dan Murphy's. This is not a compromise. It is the baseline that honest production looks like. Safe Pick 2, Starward Nova. The Starward Distillery in Port Melbourne has been producing Australian single malt since 2007, and Nova is their flagship expression, available at Dan Murphy's and BWS stores across the country. Starward ages Australian barley malt in Australian red wine barrels, Shiraz and Cabernet casks from local wineries, which imparts a fruit character unique to the expression and genuinely traceable to its origin. No caramel colouring, no chill filtration. Everything in the glass was put there by grain, time, and wood without artificial assistance. Nova is typically bottled between 3 and 4 years old, which in Scotch terms would be considered young. But active red wine barrels deliver more flavour development than conventional Scotch casks, and the result is a whiskey with genuine complexity, deep fruit notes, vanilla, and a richness that no blended Scotch at the same $35 to $40 Australian price point can match. Jim Murray's Whisky Bible and the International Whisky Competition have recognised Starward with awards. This is Australian whiskey that belongs on the world stage, and it is in your local bottle shop right now. Safe Pick 1, Lark Single Malt. Bill Lark pioneered legal whiskey distillation in Tasmania in 1992, and the distillery he founded has become the benchmark for all Australian single malt. Lark single malt is made from Australian barley, matured in small quarter casks using new American oak and export and sherry casks, and bottled at around 46% without chill filtration. No caramel colouring, no additives of any kind. What goes into the still goes into the barrel, and what leaves the barrel goes into the bottle. The small cask maturation accelerates wood contact, producing genuine richness and complexity. The nose is full and warm, with dried fruit, vanilla, and a distinct Tasmanian character that whiskey experts describe as unlike anything produced anywhere else. The palate is warming and complex, with spice and dark fruit, and a finish that extends beyond what the alcohol level would suggest. Jim Murray awarded Lark Single Malt a score in the 90s in his Whiskey Bible. International competitions have named it among the finest whiskies in the Southern Hemisphere. A bottle costs more than Johnny Walker Red Label at Dan Murphy's. It should. You're paying for real grain, real barrels, and real time without a drop of caramel colouring to pretend otherwise. And there you have it. 10 whiskies hiding behind familiar labels, premium positioning, and the colour chemistry of E150A. FSANZ does not require whiskey producers to declare artificial caramel colouring on Australian bottles, and the major global spirits corporations have taken full advantage of that regulatory gap for decades. Diageo, Pernod Ricard, and Beam Suntory know exactly what consumers see when they pick up a warm amber bottle. But Lark, Starward, and Archie Rose prove that Australian producers have chosen a different path entirely. Real grain, real barrels, real transparency, no shortcuts. The next time you stand at the Dan Murphy's or BWS counter, look for the age statement, look for the colouring declaration, and if neither exists, ask yourself what the bottle is hiding. Drop a comment below with the whiskey you reach for right now. Stay sharp, stay informed, and keep rising.